Hello, welcome to my talk titled Korean Art from 1953. My name is Kimberly Chung, and I'm an assistant professor of Korean Literary and Cultural Studies at McGill University. I've been invited by Korean Cultural Center Canada to introduce, by online recording, a recent book publication titled Korean Art from 1953, Collision, Innovation, Interaction. This anthology was co-edited with my colleagues, art historian Minjung, curator Sunjun Kim, and film scholar Keith Wagner. It was published in 2020 and has since been critically acclaimed. This book is the first anthology of essays that survey and analyze developments in Korean modern and contemporary art from 1953 to the present. And today I will summarize some key points made in the introduction of the book that was written by myself and my colleague Minjung. I hope that this lecture will introduce the book and more generally Korean modern and contemporary art to the Ottawa and Canadian public. Thank you. The idea for this book began with what we saw as a surge of interest in Korean popular culture and commercial films. We noticed that in comparison to this rising popularity, there was a relatively lack of English language resources and scholarly materials about Korean modern and contemporary art. So in response, Minjung brainstormed and initiated this project with the help of curator Sunjun Kim, me, and Keith B. Wagner. We then held a workshop with knowledgeable experts in the field, and this led to a 2-day symposium with the chapter contributors at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art with the support of Korea Arts Management Service. So through these events, over the course of a year, this anthology became fully conceptualized. So our main aim for this project was to gather top researchers and scholars who share a variety of critical perspectives on diverse developments in Korean art. And we also had a few conceptual target goals in mind. For one, we hoped that this collaboration could resist a regionalist reading. So we wanted to really focus on incorporating important global contexts, global cultural flows, transnational moments that really shaped Korean modern and contemporary art. So like the art of the Korean diaspora, like North Korean art after the division of the peninsula. So we agreed that a very important facet of Korean contemporary art was its globality after a certain point. Secondly, we hope that this project would introduce a new trajectory, a new method of Korean art criticism. So introducing a very cultural studies approach to understanding the interrelationship of aesthetic practice and the importance of socio-political contexts. The book anthology is divided into 14 chapters and 2 parts. The first part of the book is titled The Korean Avant-Garde, Modernism and Modernity, 1953 to 1987. While the time period does note 1953 as the beginning point, in the first chapter, that discussion actually really begins with the colonial period. However, we did want to give a kind of periodic mark to the beginning stages of visual art that followed the liberation of Korea from Imperial Japan in 1945, the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, and the division of the peninsula into North and South Korea in 1953 through that Korean Armistice Agreement. So in this first section, the contributors discuss the art movements and art collectives that evolved and flourished from these beginning stages in that post-war period to art production in the 60s, 70s, and 80s under a very tumultuous political climate under authoritarian military regimes during those 3 decades. The second part of the book is titled From Postmodernism to Contemporaneity in Korea, 1988 to the present. And we chose 1988 as a very turning point in South Korean contemporary history. It was a very important year that signified many things like the beginning of Korean democratization after the fall of a long period of authoritarian military governments. And subsequently, after this point, you have the globalization of South Korea, where Korean contemporary art becomes more internationally minded, as detailed in chapter 9 by Sun Jung's chapter on the Gwangju Biennale, Busan Biennale, and Media City Seoul. While part 1 in the book marks 1953 as a starting point in Korean art history and the beginning of contemporary Korean art, I think scholar Carrie Park really gives a more complex view to that beginning point. So chapter 1, which is titled Korean Modern Art and the Conflicts of Tradition and Modernity, actually begins with the Korean artists who lived through the colonial period in the early 20th century, when Korea was a colony of Imperial Japan. An important feature of this chapter is how Park very emphasizes the continuities and the discontinuities between artistic production before and after the liberation, and really spans a very kind of rapidly shifting socio-political climate, but that really shaped discourse around Korean art and art practice. So during this time, you have not only the colonial period, the Korean liberation, and the Korean War and the post-war climate. And so you have so much socio-political change during this time. In the beginning of the 20th century, the importation of Western products, religions at the beginning under Japanese imperialism made this lasting impression, and the modernization vis-a-vis Japanese colonialism, the U.S. military presence during the Korean War. So all of these important contexts greatly influenced the production of art of this period. A socio-political structure that Park talks about at length is the Chosun Art Exhibition. The Chosun Art Exhibition was held every year during the colonial period from 1922 to 1944 by the Japanese colonial authorities. This exhibition in particular was representative of how you had colonial structures that bracketed Korean art around local color and a kind of, quote, Koreanness. And Pak does a really good job of tracing the Japanese colonial government's endorsement of certain motifs, mediums, and pictorial characteristics that would remain colonial legacies in Korean art in the post-war period. So through a close examination of the works of Korean modernists like Park Soo-geun, Lee Ik-no, Lee Jung-seop, Kim Hwang-gi, Yoon Young-guk, Seo Se-ok, Park tells us and really illustrates the struggles of developing a unique Korean aesthetics that was in conversation with international currents of modernism, and how Western art trends like abstract expressionism, informel, Fauvism, Cubism became very important conduits for these artists' reinterpretations and modernizations of Korean tradition. Pak says, quote, "These artists created a discursive space of modernist art and the historical turmoil of colonialism by presenting the identity politics of, quote, Koreanness. We can also see how these artists endeavored to create an aesthetic vernacular modernism in Korea," end quote. Continuing into the 1960s, international art trends remained important influences, and a minority of artists organized in art collectives and began to branch out into art experimentation, oppositional art experimentation. And on a larger scale, it really reflected how this period was a time of great political agitation. For example, the April 19th, 1960 student-led revolution led to the resignation of the first president of the Republic of Korean government, Syngman Rhee. So on many levels, I think in art practice, in politics, in Korean society at large, that the beginning of the 1960s represented what Chung calls a, quote, generational shift that really enforced a break with the past. So Yeon Shim-jung in a second chapter titled "Historicizing the Avant-Garde Context in Post-War Korea from Experimental Arts to Collective Groups in the 60s and 70s," really tackles that zeitgeist, the avant-garde zeitgeist of the 60s and 70s, where you had these street demonstrations targeting the corrupt art establishment, bleeding into protests against the dictatorial Korean government. And this is an image of the Union exhibition of young Korean artists in a 1967 street demonstration. So Chung focuses on several important collective groups: Origin Group, Union Exhibition, Zero Group, Fourth Group, AG, standing for Avant-Garde, ST, Space and Time, and documents the way these groups really broke with that post-war generation who espoused international abstract art trends, and how these groups forged very innovative art forms. So works like Union exhibitions happening with Vinyl Umbrella and Candle on December 14th, 1967, was the first of its kind in post-war Korean art, and employed mixed sculpture installation, audience participation. And Yeonshim describes this happening as, quote, "This happening began with orderly gestures, theatrical staging, and harmonious vocals, yet ended up in a chaotic, entropic performance," end quote. These important collectives called for experiments and new mediums, tapping into the temporal and spatial changes in a rapidly industrializing Korean society. and a rapidly changing urban environment, and it was reflected in their art practice. These artists moved beyond fixed materials and form. They experimented, pushing the boundaries of aesthetic principles and artistic practice. Around the same period, you had an interest in a monochromatic style of painting, viewed as a kind of extension of anti-art practice that was beginning to emerge. This style came to be called Dansaekhwa in the 1970s. And so I think while Dansaekhwa was a very disparate movement, it has been connected and characterized by the meaning of its name, quote, to paint in monochrome. It has also been characterized by the color white, and this impression through the color white was enhanced by art critic Ye's focus on this color white in his foundational work that was published in an exhibition catalog of Tokyo Gallery in 1975, coining the term thinking white. So in chapter 3, Dansaekhwa, Beyond the Color of Painting, scholar Kim Soon goes beyond broad impressions of Dansaekhwa with very careful attention to the pictorial characteristics and art historical context in the works of Dansaekhwa artists like Kwon Young-woo, Chung Jung-seop, Park So-bo, Yoon Young-gun, Jung Sang-hwa, Ha Jong-hyun, and Choi Myung-young. So while Kim explains that these artists typically used non-representation and flatness, much like the Western modernists, she also demonstrates that the artists integrated an identifiably, quote, Korean sensibility through the use of idiosyncratic painterly methods. And Kim describes these practices as exhibiting a kind of, quote, informality, a randomness, a lack of artificiality. And another distinctive feature was their use of alternative materials like hanji, which is a kind of Korean paper, pencil, ink, paintbrush, and rollers. Their methods have been described as leaving traces of a kind of repetitive bodily gesture, a residue of calligraphy. In Korean historiography, the 70s, the 1970s, and 1980s are much typified by tumultuous conflict. So tumultuous conflict between many allied activists like intellectuals, students, laborers, and artists against what was the oppressive authoritarian regimes of this time. One oppositional movement that called for democracy was what was called the Minjung movement. And the Minjung movement was a very multifaceted, very layered. It involved intellectual discourse. It involved also a grassroots political struggle. But the Minjung movement really was proliferated across so many various mediums. So while the Minjung movement and its artistic counterpart called Minjung art were very important vehicles of social critique, it was very important to include Jung Eun-shin's chapter called Reality and Utterance in and Against Minjung Art, who uncovers aspects of Minjung art that have previously been overlooked because in the past it's really been talked about as a very overt political art made in a turbulent context. Shin focuses on one artist collective in particular, 현실과 발언, who can be translated as reality and utterance. And he describes how the group engaged with the urbanization of the city, its visual culture, the advertisements, billboards, posters, and kitsch paintings that dotted the landscape. And I think while the collective really expressed a cynicism toward the rapid development of a consumer culture, there was an embrace of everyday visual culture in its art production. And Shin points out that they really refashioned Korean art as a quote, communicative, accessible, and democratic medium. In reflecting on 현실과 발언's long-term significance, Shin writes, quote, reality and utterance sparked the emergence of Minjung art in the 1980s. This suggests that the groundbreaking art movement began by incorporating visual and material elements from the realm of everyday culture. Whether it is called pop, kitsch, or vernacular, the ambient imagery and material culture has its pros and cons, both of which are discerned, explored, and appreciated depending on the changing political cultures in the extended history of Minjung art and its legacies. End quote. In the following chapter, titled Photography's Crooked Path from State Apparatus to the Monument of Democracy, Youngjun Lee traces the development of Korean photography over the last half of the 20th century. And I think this chapter provides a very interesting conversation, an interesting comparison to Chung Shin's analysis of Minjung art's engagement with Korean urban material culture. So Lee explores how photographers like Han Young-soo experimented with unconventional camera angles to capture the quote speed and transience of modern life, end quote, and he calls it a quote new phenomenological awareness, end quote, that really emphasized, illustrated, captured the aggressive industrial and economic development after the Korean War. Lee also documents how photography took on many different forms and many different visions at other moments during the latter 20th century. So, for example, after the devastation of the Korean War, this photograph by Lee Myung-sik's Looking for Work, Seeking Work, as it's titled, became a snapshot of the poverty and desolation of post-war South Korea. Lee's very astute analysis of photography during the 70s and 80s further explores photography's very complex role in both perhaps promoting Seoul as a glossy hub for global tourism, but also pointing to the subversion of that in photography. So work like artist Kim Gi-chan, who uses the medium of photography to lay bare, to unveil the reality of daily life in Seoul.